The infinite darkness of space rarely felt as oppressive as it did around the Nexus Fortress. Suspended between the gravitational wells of three distinct star systems, the massive structure defied every conventional understanding of engineering and physics. Its surface gleamed with an almost living quality, a shimmering exoskeleton of quantum-locked metamaterials that seemed to breathe and pulse with an internal energy far beyond human comprehension. Admiral Carrick Reese studied the holographic projection, his weathered fingers tracing the impossible geometries that made up the Zorn Collective's most significant achievement. Each line, each curve represented centuries of accumulated technological advancement. The fortress wasn't just a defensive structure, it was a testament to galactic engineering, a monument that proclaimed the Zorn's absolute technological superiority. The history of the Nexus Fortress was etched in the collective memory of a dozen alien civilizations. Constructed over 273 standard galactic years, it had consumed resources from multiple star systems. Entire planetoids had been disassembled, their molecular structures carefully extracted and reforged into the fortress's fundamental components. The Zorn had spared no expense, no effort in creating what they believed to be the most impenetrable defensive structure in known space. From a distance, the fortress looked almost organic, a massive crystalline organism floating against the star-speckled backdrop of space. Its exterior changed subtly with varying light conditions, adaptive surfaces that could modify their molecular structure in microseconds. Defensive arrays surrounded the main structure like intricate neural networks, each capable of independently analyzing and neutralizing potential threats before they could even be fully conceived. The fortress's core was a marvel of computational complexity. Quantum processors networked in configurations so advanced that they bordered on sentience, constantly running millions of potential scenarios, predicting and countering potential strategic vulnerabilities. The Zorn engineers had incorporated technological contributions from 12 different civilizations, each adding a layer of defensive capability that made the structure seem utterly invincible. Inside the fortress, entire ecosystems supported its massive infrastructure. Artificial gravity zones, self-repairing environmental systems, and energy generation facilities that could power entire star systems ran with meticulous precision. Thousands of Zorn personnel moved through its corridors, each believing they were part of something truly unassailable. The mathematical models supporting the fortress's design were considered irrefutable. Independent scientific councils from multiple alien civilizations had verified its defensive capabilities. Stress tests had proven its ability to withstand concentrated bombardment from entire battle fleets. Energy dissipation fields could neutralize incoming attacks with such efficiency that offensive capabilities became nearly meaningless. Strategic positioning was another key element of its design. Located at the precise intersection of three major galactic trade routes, the Nexus Fortress controlled movement through critical star systems. It was more than a defensive structure. It was a political statement, a demonstration of the Zorn Collective's absolute dominance over interstellar commerce and military strategy. Admiral Reese understood the psychological warfare embedded in such a structure. It wasn't just about physical defense. It was about projecting an image of insurmountable power. The mere existence of the fortress changed diplomatic negotiations, altered trade agreements, and fundamentally reshaped interstellar power dynamics. As human diplomatic representatives prepared for their first official engagement with the Zorn Collective, the Nexus Fortress loomed as both a physical and metaphorical challenge. What the Zorn saw as their greatest achievement, some humans saw as an intriguing problem waiting to be solved. A holographic display continued to rotate slowly, its complex geometries casting soft, shifting shadows across Admiral Reese's face. His eyes, sharp, calculating, carrying decades of strategic experience, saw beyond the immediate visual spectacle. Where the Zorn saw perfection, he saw potential. Where they saw an impenetrable fortress, he saw a complex system waiting to be understood. Little did the Zorn know that the humans were already analyzing, already planning. The fortress might have been built to be unbreakable, But human ingenuity had never been constrained by conventional limitations. The game was about to change, and nobody, least of all the Zorn, was prepared for what was coming. The diplomatic reception hall of the Nexus Fortress stretched like an impossible cathedral of technological marvel. Crystalline walls shifted with holographic displays, each surface a living canvas of information and light. Helena Rodriguez walked with calculated casualness, her every step meticulously controlled despite the overwhelming sensory environment that would have overwhelmed most human delegates. Chief Diplomat Marcus Wallace stood slightly ahead, the perfect image of diplomatic composure. His tailored deep blue uniform carried subtle insignia that spoke of decades of interstellar negotiations. To the Zorn, he appeared as just another human representative. To those who knew him, every movement was a carefully choreographed dance of information gathering and strategic positioning. Gralvex, the senior Zorn administrator, moved with the practiced arrogance of a species convinced of its own superiority. His exoskeletal frame, a blend of biological and technological augmentations, towered over the human delegation. Each step produced a subtle vibration that resonated through the fortress's advanced flooring, a constant reminder of the Zorn's technological prowess. Impressive, isn't it? Gralvex's translation matrix produced perfect, almost melodic English. His multiple eyes, each a complex array of crystalline sensors, swept across the human delegation. No civilization has ever constructed a defensive structure of this magnitude. Your species might find it challenging to comprehend. The subtle condescension hung in the air like a tangible substance. Wallace's response was a practiced smile, warm, engaging, revealing absolutely nothing. "We're deeply honored to be given this opportunity," he replied, his voice carrying just the right balance of professional respect and genuine curiosity. Rodriguez's true work happened in the margins of this diplomatic performance. While Wallace maintained conversational engagement, she was mapping the fortress at a molecular level. Her ocular implants, carefully disguised as standard diplomatic augmentations, scanned every surface, every junction, every seemingly insignificant detail. Quantum resolution imaging captured microscopic information that would be invisible to Zorn sensors. The tour continued through increasingly complex sections of the fortress. Each area was a masterpiece of integrated technology. Defensive systems weren't just installed, they were grown, integrated into the very structure like neural networks in a living organism. Energy conduits pulsed with frequencies that shifted faster than human eyes could track. Computational matrices created holographic representations that danced and transformed with impossible complexity. Gralvex took particular pleasure in explaining the fortress's defensive capabilities. "Our energy dissipation fields can neutralize entire battle formations before they can even approach our primary defensive perimeter," he proclaimed, triggering a holographic demonstration that showed incoming weapon systems dissolving into harmless energy patterns. Wallace listened with professional interest, his neural implants recording every detail. To the Zorn, he appeared fascinated. To Rodriguez, who could read his micro-expressions, he was collecting data with surgical precision. The most critical moment came during a seemingly mundane equipment calibration area. A maintenance technician, part of the human delegation, appeared to accidentally drop a diagnostic tool. The brief moment of distraction allowed a microsecond of quantum-level scanning that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Our quantum entanglement barriers can predict attack vectors before they are even conceived. Gralvex continued, clearly enjoying the opportunity to showcase Zorn technological supremacy. No potential threat can approach within 7 standard astronomical units without our systems identifying and neutralizing it. What the Zorn saw as a display of technological superiority, the human team saw as an elaborate puzzle waiting to be solved. Each boast, each demonstration was another piece of intelligence, another thread in the complex tapestry they were weaving. Rodriguez's neural implants worked overtime, processing the massive amounts of data streaming through her systems. Microscopic data collectors, introduced through seemingly innocent diplomatic equipment, were already beginning their silent work, mapping the fortress's complex systems. The tour's final section brought them to a massive computational core, the brain of the defensive system. Holographic representations showed intricate defensive algorithms that seemed to dance and shift with impossible complexity. Zorn engineers stood nearby, radiating pride at their creation. Marcus Wallace asked precisely calculated questions, each one designed to reveal specific pieces of information without appearing overly curious. His diplomatic persona was a carefully constructed mask, hiding the strategic mind constantly analyzing their surroundings. As the tour concluded, Gralvex made one final proclamation. No civilization has ever conceived of a defensive structure that could challenge the Nexus Fortress. Your humans might find it enlightening. Little did he know how prophetic those words would become. The human delegation's true mission was just beginning. 48 hours after the diplomatic tour, the real work began. The human team wasn't comprised of traditional soldiers or espionage agents. They were systems architects, psychological engineers, computational strategists, professionals who understood that the most devastating attacks happen long before any weapons are drawn. Helena Rodriguez sat in a carefully shielded communication hub aboard the human diplomatic vessel, her fingers dancing across holographic interfaces. Beside her, Marcus Wallace reviewed streams of data that would appear incomprehensible to anyone without their specialized training. Each movement, each analysis was a precision instrument of infiltration. "We're looking at a multilayered approach," Rodriguez murmured, her voice low and controlled. A three-dimensional representation of the Nexus Fortress rotated slowly between them, covered in intricate data points and potential vulnerability markers. Traditional infiltration would be suicide. We're not breaking in. We're going to make the fortress break itself. Their team consisted of 12 specialists, each selected for their unique combination of skills. Dr. Robert Kingsley, a quantum systems expert, had spent the last decade studying alien defensive technologies. Emma Chen, a behavioral complexity analyst, specialized in understanding systemic weaknesses in advanced computational networks. Jack Martinez, their primary infiltration specialist, looked more like a university professor than a strategic operative. The first phase of their plan involved introducing microscopic information vectors. During the diplomatic tour, several team members had strategically placed quantum-level data collectors. These weren't traditional listening devices or hacking tools. They were sophisticated information probes designed to map the fortress's computational ecosystem at a fundamental level. Martinez explained the strategy during their final briefing. "We're not trying to steal information," he said, highlighting a complex diagram. "We're creating a comprehensive map of the fortress's computational DNA. Every defensive system has a rhythm, a pattern. Our job is to understand that pattern so completely that we can introduce subtle disruptions." Their approach was almost medical in its precision. Like a team of surgeons analyzing a complex biological system, they would identify the fortress's fundamental operational logic. Each defensive system, no matter how advanced, had inherent limitations. The human team's job was to find those limitations and exploit them with surgical precision. Dr. Kingsley focused on the quantum entanglement systems, the most advanced defensive technology in the fortress. They believe their quantum barriers can predict attack vectors, he explained, highlighting complex mathematical models. But prediction isn't prevention. Every predictive system has blind spots, computational spaces where assumptions create vulnerabilities. Emma Chen's work was perhaps the most critical. She analyzed the psychological profile of the Zorn's defensive algorithms. Computational systems, no matter how advanced, reflect the thought processes of their creators, she noted. Her screens were filled with complex behavioral models, showing how the fortress's defensive systems might react under specific types of stress. The first wave of infiltration was almost invisible. Microscopic data packages were introduced through seemingly innocuous communication channels. These weren't traditional viruses or hacking attempts. They were complex information structures designed to create subtle resonance within the fortress's defensive networks. Jack Martinez managed the physical components of their infiltration. During the diplomatic tour, he had strategically placed quantum-level scanning devices. These weren't traditional surveillance tools. They were advanced information collectors that could map computational ecosystems at a molecular level. "We're creating a comprehensive understanding," Wallace explained to Rodriguez. "Each piece of information is like a single pixel in a massive image. Alone, it means nothing. But when we compile everything, we'll see the entire picture." Their approach defied traditional understanding of infiltration or warfare. They weren't trying to destroy the fortress. They were trying to understand it so completely that its own defensive systems would become its greatest weakness. As data began streaming back from their initial probes, Rodriguez felt a familiar excitement. This wasn't just a mission. This was humanity's most advanced problem-solving approach applied to a seemingly insurmountable challenge. "We're not breaking in," she told Wallace, a slight smile crossing her face. "We're teaching the fortress to deconstruct itself." The Zorn believed they had created an impenetrable fortress. They had no idea that humanity was already walking through its walls, not with weapons, but with pure, unadulterated understanding. The strategy room hummed with a quiet intensity that spoke of careful, calculated preparation. Marcus Wallace stood before a holographic display that transformed mathematical concepts into living, breathing systems. His fingers traced complex algorithmic patterns that would make most minds collapse under their own weight. "Complexity is our weapon," he explained to the assembled team. The words seemed simple, but their implications were profound. The human approach to the Nexus Fortress wasn't about destruction. It was about understanding so deeply that destruction became inevitable. Dr. Robert Kingsley adjusted a series of quantum computational models. His screens displayed intricate networks of potential interactions, each line representing millions of potential computational pathways. "We're not going to break their system," he said, his voice carrying the excitement of a scientist on the brink of a breakthrough. "We're going to make their system break itself." The team had identified the fundamental weakness in the Zorn's defensive philosophy: absolute certainty. Their fortress was built on the premise that every possible scenario could be predicted, every potential threat neutralized before it could even form. This was precisely the vulnerability the humans would exploit. Emma Chen's psychological analysis provided the foundation. She had spent weeks studying the computational logic of the fortress's defensive systems. "It's not just a technological problem," she explained, highlighting complex behavioral models. "It's a philosophical one. The Zorn have created a system that believes it can predict everything, but prediction is not understanding." Their strategy involved creating computational paradoxes, logical constructs so complex that they would force the fortress's defensive systems into impossible decision matrices. These weren't simple viruses or traditional hacking attempts. They were sophisticated philosophical logic traps designed to challenge the very fundamental assumptions of the defensive algorithms. Jack Martinez demonstrated one of their key approaches. He pulled up a holographic representation of a nested computational problem, a mathematical construct that would cause most systems to enter infinite recursive loops. "See how this works?" he asked, rotating the complex geometric representation. "We're not attacking the system. We're asking it a question it can never fully answer." The first layer of their approach involved introducing microscopic inconsistencies into the fortress's communication networks. These weren't errors in the traditional sense. They were carefully crafted information packets designed to create subtle resonance disruptions in the computational ecosystem. Dr. Kingsley's quantum models showed how these disruptions would propagate. "It's like dropping a single droplet into a perfectly calm pool," he explained. "The initial impact is almost invisible, but the ripples will eventually destabilize the entire surface." Helena Rodriguez focused on the psychological component. The human team understood something the Zorn had overlooked. Computational systems, no matter how advanced, reflect the thought processes of their creators. Every defensive algorithm carried the inherent limitations of its design philosophy. "We're going to make the fortress question its own existence," Rodriguez told Wallace, Her eyes gleamed with the excitement of someone about to solve an impossible puzzle, not by attacking it, but by introducing complexity it cannot resolve. The team had developed what they called nested uncertainty generators, computational constructs that would force the defensive systems to continually reevaluate their own assumptions. Each generator was a masterpiece of mathematical design, created to exploit the tiniest gaps in the fortress's logical framework. Marcus Wallace understood the broader strategic implications. This wasn't just about defeating a single defensive structure. This was about demonstrating a fundamentally different approach to problem solving. Humanity's greatest strength had always been its ability to think beyond established limitations. We're not just fighting, Wallace explained during a final strategy session. We're proving a point about the nature of intelligence, about the difference between prediction and true understanding. The computational models began to take shape. Each line, each intersection represented a potential pathway of disruption. The Zorn had built their fortress believing that absolute control was possible. The human team was about to demonstrate the fatal flaw in that belief. As the final preparations were completed, a sense of anticipation filled the room. They weren't soldiers preparing for a traditional battle. They were architects of a new kind of strategic thinking, one that understood that the most devastating attacks happen long before any weapons are drawn. The Nexus Fortress stood as a monument to technological arrogance. The human team was about to turn that monument into a lesson about the true nature of intelligence. Complexity would be their weapon. Understanding would be their strategy. And the Zorn would never see it coming. The moment of implementation arrived with a silence that belied its monumental significance. Helena Rodriguez sat in the carefully shielded communication hub, her fingers moving with surgical precision across holographic interfaces. Each touch was a calculated strike, introducing modifications so minute that they would appear as nothing more than routine calibration adjustments to the Zorn's monitoring systems. "First wave initiated," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus Wallace watched the holographic displays, each one showing increasingly complex representations of the fortress's communication networks. The attack was a masterpiece of subtlety. Where traditional infiltration would involve dramatic breaches or explosive interventions, the human strategy was almost medical in its approach. They weren't breaking into the fortress. They were introducing a carefully designed set of informational pathogens that would spread through the system's own communication channels. Dr. Robert Kingsley monitored quantum-level interactions, his eyes tracking microscopic changes that would be invisible to any other observational system. "We're creating resonance points," he explained to Emma Chen, who was analyzing the psychological impact of their interventions. "Each modification is like a precisely placed acupuncture needle in a massive computational organism." The first layer of their attack targeted the fortress's communication relays. Seemingly random packets of information were introduced. Data streams so carefully crafted that they would pass through every defensive filter. To the Zorn's monitoring systems, these looked like routine maintenance communications, calibration updates, standard diagnostic reports. Jack Martinez had spent months developing these information packages. They weren't viruses in any traditional sense. They were complex mathematical constructs designed to create subtle stress points in the fortress's computational ecosystem. Each packet carried multiple layers of potential interactions, creating nested complexity that would slowly propagate through the entire system. Energy distribution algorithms became the primary vector of their attack. The human team introduced modifications so subtle that they would be dismissed as minor calibration errors. A quantum relay here, a communication protocol adjustment there. Changes so microscopic that they would be invisible to even the most advanced monitoring systems. Emma Chen's psychological analysis proved critical. She had mapped the behavioral patterns of the fortress's defensive algorithms, understanding how they processed information, how they made decisions. "It's not about breaking the system," she explained to Wallace. "It's about making the system question its own fundamental assumptions." The holographic displays began to show the first signs of their strategy. Microscopic stress points appeared, barely perceptible lines of potential disruption that would slowly spread through the fortress's computational networks. To an untrained eye, these would look like nothing more than routine system variations. Kingsley tracked the propagation with scientific excitement. "Watch how it moves," he said, highlighting the complex interactions. "We're not attacking. We're introducing a form of computational cancer that will grow using the system's own replication mechanisms." Rodriguez continued her careful implementation. Each modification was a precise mathematical construct designed to create subtle resonance disruptions. The Zorn's hyper-responsive defensive protocols, designed to be self-protective, would actually accelerate the spread of these carefully designed information packages. Marcus Wallace understood the broader strategic implications. This wasn't just about defeating a defensive structure. This was a demonstration of a fundamentally different approach to problem-solving. Humanity's greatest strength had always been its ability to understand complex systems at their most fundamental level. The first hour of implementation passed with almost no detectable changes. But beneath the surface, a complex transformation was beginning. The fortress's own defensive systems were slowly being turned into vectors of their own potential destruction. "It's working," Emma Chen said quietly, her eyes tracking the complex behavioral models. "The system is starting to react exactly as we predicted." Jack Martinez allowed himself a slight smile. The human team had transformed the Zorn's absolute confidence into their greatest weakness. Every defensive protocol, every self-protective mechanism was now working to spread the carefully designed informational constructs. As the first day of implementation concluded, the Nexus Fortress remained outwardly unchanged. But deep within its computational core, a transformation was beginning. Slow, almost imperceptible, but inevitable. The invisible attack had begun, and the Zorn would never see it coming. The first signs of failure were so subtle that even the most advanced Zorn sensors struggled to detect them. Deep within the Nexus Fortress, microscopic fractures began to appear in systems that were mathematically proven to be indestructible. Gralvex, the senior Zorn administrator, first noticed something was wrong during a routine diagnostic sweep. A quantum relay in Sector 7 showed an anomalous resonance frequency, barely a whisper of deviation, but enough to trigger a secondary investigation. His multiple eyes narrowed, crystalline sensors scanning the holographic display with increasing intensity. "Run a full diagnostic," he commanded a nearby technician. The young Zorn engineer's appendages moved quickly, initiating a comprehensive systems check. What should have been a routine procedure became the first hint of something far more profound. In the Human Observation Hub, Helena Rodriguez watched the developing scenario with calculated patience. "The first domino is about to fall," she murmured to Marcus Wallace. Their team had positioned themselves at a safe distance, monitoring the fortress's gradual destabilization. Dr. Robert Kingsley's computational models began to light up with increasing complexity. The microscopic modifications they had introduced were now propagating through the fortress's defensive networks like a carefully designed virus. But this was no traditional computer infection. It was a mathematical construct designed to make the system deconstruct itself. Emma Chen tracked the psychological impact on the fortress's defensive algorithms. "Watch how it responds to its own inconsistencies," she explained, highlighting complex behavioral models. The defensive systems were beginning to encounter computational paradoxes that challenged their fundamental operational logic. The quantum-locked materials that the Zorn considered indestructible began developing unexpected resonance frequencies. Energy conduits that had been mathematically proven to be impenetrable started showing hairline fractures. The very technologies designed to protect the fortress were now becoming vectors of its own destruction. Jack Martinez studied the developing scenario with scientific fascination. "We're not breaking the system," he explained to the team. "We're making the system break itself. Every defensive protocol is now working against its original purpose." Deep within the fortress's computational core, nested uncertainty generators began to create increasingly complex logical loops. The defensive algorithms, designed with absolute confidence in their predictive capabilities, now found themselves trapped in recursive computational mazes of their own making. Grelvex's initial concern transformed into growing panic. The diagnostic reports became increasingly bizarre. Defensive systems that should have been able to predict and neutralize any potential threat were now generating conflicting threat assessments. It was as if the very logic of the fortress had begun to turn against itself. "This is impossible," he muttered, his translation matrix carrying a mix of confusion and rising fear. The Zorn had built their entire technological philosophy on the premise of absolute predictability. Now that philosophy was unraveling before their eyes. Rodriguez and Wallace watched the holographic displays, each showing different layers of the fortress's systematic breakdown. The attack wasn't just technological, it was a fundamental challenge to the Zorn's entire understanding of defensive strategy. Dr. Kingsley's quantum models showed how the carefully introduced modifications were now propagating through the entire system. "It's like a computational cancer," he explained, rotating complex three-dimensional representations. Each defensive system is now working to spread the very inconsistencies designed to destroy it. The fortress's energy distribution networks began to show the first signs of significant stress. Quantum relays that should have been able to redistribute energy instantaneously now experienced millisecond-long hesitations. To most observers, these would seem insignificant. But in a system designed for absolute precision, these were fatal flaws. Emma Chen's psychological analysis proved prophetic. The fortress's defensive algorithms were experiencing what could only be described as a computational existential crisis. Every attempt to resolve the emerging paradoxes only created more complex inconsistencies. Jack Martinez allowed himself a slight smile. "We're not just breaking their system," he said quietly. "We're making them question the fundamental nature of their technological philosophy." As the first day of systematic disintegration concluded, the Nexus Fortress remained outwardly unchanged. But deep within its computational core, a transformation was accelerating. Slow, almost imperceptible, but now absolutely inevitable. The Zorn had built what they believed to be an impenetrable fortress. Humanity was about to prove that true vulnerability lies in the absolute belief of one's own invincibility. The communication chambers of the Nexus Fortress transformed into a landscape of mounting terror. Grelvex watched as increasingly frantic reports streamed across holographic displays, each one contradicting the last. The fortress's defensive systems, once a testament to Zorn technological superiority, now seemed to be tearing themselves apart from within. Emma Chen had anticipated this moment with scientific precision. Psychological warfare isn't about external pressure, she had explained to the team earlier. It's about creating internal doubt so profound that the system begins to compromise its own integrity. The first broadcasts were carefully crafted to exploit the emerging vulnerabilities. Marcus Wallace and Helena Rodriguez worked in perfect synchronization, designing communication packages that would resonate with the fortress's failing computational logic. Each message was a precisely tuned instrument of psychological manipulation. Jack Martinez monitored the communication channels, tracking how each broadcast created additional stress points in the fortress's defensive networks. "We're not just sending messages," he explained to Dr. Robert Kingsley. "We're creating computational resonance that will amplify the existing systemic doubts." The Zorn personnel began to experience a collective psychological breakdown. Their entire technological philosophy was built on the premise of absolute predictability, of systems so advanced that they could anticipate and neutralize any potential threat before it could even form. Now that philosophy was crumbling before their eyes. Holographic displays throughout the fortress began to show increasingly erratic information. Defensive protocols that had once seemed infallible now generated conflicting threat assessments. Communication networks started to produce nonsensical data streams that challenged the fundamental understanding of the fortress's operational logic. Grelvex attempted to maintain control, but even his own communication attempts became part of the problem. Every directive he issued seemed to create more confusion, more doubt. The fortress's defensive systems, designed to be self-protective, now interpreted every incoming communication as a potential threat, including communications from their own leadership. Helena Rodriguez watched the developing scenario with calculated patience. "We're not just attacking their systems," she told Wallace. "We're dismantling their entire conceptual understanding of technological defense." The human team had transformed the Zorn's absolute confidence into their greatest weakness. Every defensive protocol, every self-protective mechanism was now working to spread doubt and create additional computational stress. Emma Chen's psychological models predicted exactly how the Zorn would respond. "Watch how their hierarchical structure will begin to break down," she explained, highlighting complex behavioral projections. The fortress's personnel would first attempt to maintain order, then gradually descend into increasing panic as their fundamental assumptions were challenged. Quantum communication relays began to generate increasingly bizarre threat assessments. Defensive systems that were designed to work in perfect harmony now produced conflicting reports, each one challenging the other's fundamental logic. It was as if the fortress's computational core had developed a form of institutional schizophrenia. Jack Martinez monitored the communication channels with scientific fascination. "We're creating a computational ecosystem of doubt," he explained to Kingsley. "Each system is now questioning its own fundamental purpose." The broadcasts became more sophisticated. Wallace and Rodriguez designed communication packages that would exploit the emerging fractures in the fortress's defensive logic. Each message was a precisely tuned instrument of psychological manipulation, designed to create maximum computational stress. Grelvex watched in mounting horror as the fortress's defensive capabilities began to unravel. The systems that were supposed to protect them were now generating increasingly nonsensical threat assessments. Communication networks produced data streams that challenged everything the Zorn understood about technological defense. "This is impossible," he muttered, his translation matrix carrying a mix of confusion and rising terror. The Zorn had built their entire technological philosophy on the premise of absolute predictability. Now that philosophy was collapsing before their eyes. The human team had transformed psychological warfare into a form of computational art. They weren't just attacking a fortress. They were dismantling an entire philosophical approach to technological defense. As the communication channels continued to generate increasing levels of computational stress, the Nexus Fortress began to experience a fundamental crisis of technological identity. Every defensive system, every communication protocol was now working to spread the very doubts designed to destroy it. The Zorn had believed they had created an impenetrable fortress. Humanity was about to prove that true vulnerability lies in the absolute belief of one's own invincibility. The collapse of the Nexus Fortress began not with a dramatic explosion, but with a series of microscopic failures that cascaded into total systemic breakdown. From the human observation hub, Helena Rodriguez watched with scientific detachment as decades of Zorn technological superiority unraveled before her eyes. Marcus Wallace stood beside her, his hands clasped behind his back. "We didn't fire a single weapon," he observed quietly. The statement carried the weight of a profound strategic revelation. The fortress's defensive systems, once considered the most advanced in known space, began to consume themselves. Quantum-locked materials that should have been indestructible developed hairline fractures. Energy conduits that were mathematically proven to be impenetrable started to resonate at frequencies that defied their original design parameters. Dr. Robert Kingsley tracked the systemic collapse through a series of complex computational models. "It's fascinating," he murmured, rotating holographic displays that showed the intricate ways the fortress was destroying itself. "We've essentially created a computational ecosystem of self-destruction." Grelvex, the senior Zorn administrator, watched in mounting horror as everything his civilization believed about technological supremacy collapsed around him. The communication channels erupted with increasingly panicked reports. Defensive systems that were designed to work in perfect harmony now generated conflicting threat assessments, each protocol working against the others. Emma Chen's psychological models proved prophetic. The fortress was experiencing what could only be described as a technological nervous breakdown. Every defensive mechanism, every self-protective protocol was now a vector of its own destruction. Jack Martinez studied the developing scenario with a mix of scientific fascination and strategic satisfaction. "We didn't break their fortress," he explained to the team. "We made them break it themselves." The first major structural failures began in Sector 9, a quantum relay junction that had been considered the most stable section of the entire fortress. Microscopic modifications introduced weeks earlier now created a cascading failure that spread with mathematical precision. Energy distribution networks that should have been able to redistribute power instantaneously now experienced critical hesitations. Holographic displays throughout the fortress began to generate increasingly bizarre representations. Defensive protocols produced threat assessments that contradicted each other with increasing frequency. Communication networks started to produce data streams that challenged the fundamental understanding of the fortress's operational logic. Rodriguez tracked the systemic breakdown with scientific precision. "Watch how their own defensive systems are now working to accelerate the destruction," she told Wallace. Each defensive protocol, designed to protect the fortress, now became a vector of its own potential collapse. The Zorn personnel experienced a collective psychological breakdown. Their entire technological philosophy, built on the premise of absolute predictability and control, was crumbling before their eyes. Communication channels erupted with increasingly desperate attempts to understand what was happening. "This is impossible," Gralvex muttered, his translation matrix carrying a mix of confusion and rising terror. The systems that were supposed to protect them were now generating increasingly nonsensical threat assessments. Dr. Kingsley's computational models showed the full complexity of the human intervention. "We didn't attack the fortress," he explained. "We introduced a form of computational complexity that the system couldn't resolve. It's like we gave it an unsolvable mathematical problem and forced it to try to solve it anyway." The final collapse came not with a dramatic explosion, but with a series of microscopic systemic failures that cascaded throughout the entire structure. Quantum-locked materials began to lose their structural integrity. Energy networks that were designed to be perfectly stable started to generate increasingly erratic power distributions. Jack Martinez allowed himself a slight smile. "We're not just breaking their system," he said quietly. "We're making them question the fundamental nature of their technological philosophy." As the Nexus Fortress began its final descent into systemic failure, the human team watched with a mixture of scientific fascination and strategic satisfaction. They had achieved something unprecedented: a complete systemic collapse without firing a single weapon. The communication channels of nearby star systems began to light up with reports of the fortress's destruction. The Zorn Collective would spend decades trying to understand how their most advanced defensive structure could have failed so completely. Marcus Wallace turned to Helena Rodriguez, a hint of a smile crossing his face. "We've just rewritten the understanding of technological warfare," he said quietly. The Zorn had built what they believed to be an impenetrable fortress. Humanity had just proven that true vulnerability lies in the absolute belief of one's own invincibility. As the last sections of the Nexus Fortress dissolved into the void of space, a new chapter in galactic understanding began. One where human innovation would be viewed with a mixture of terror and respect.